And right now, no Indian embassy in the world has a political appointee. Everybody is a professional diplomat or military officer by the order of the Prime Minister. He's actually said, no amateurs in this business, it's too dangerous nowadays. It's the importance of technology. One of the reasons the Quad exists, which is US, India, Japan, and the United States, Australia, is the press, and I'm a former journalist, so I'm not going to, but I won't excuse them, call it a NATO, Asian NATO. No, it's fundamentally about technology. And if you look at its insides, 6 major working groups, a bunch of side working groups, 26 sub-working groups, almost all of them are technology. They're about AI, quantum computing, semiconductors, green hydrogen. We have right now 42 warships that fight, not like patrol vessels or support vessels. India is building right now 68 such vessels, actually being built, which means 150% increase in capacity just because American warships are leaving the Indian Ocean, Chinese warships are entering. India wants to make sure it's involved. 10 Indian warships are now off the coast of Yemen, quietly supporting the American actions there, without directly fighting the Houthis. But it's part of the fact that we have to build capacities which we never had before. Thank you. I specialize in geopolitics, or my company is a risk consultancy, and increasingly that means geopolitics, because that's what we specialize in. So why is geopolitics really a problem? Well, the answer is yes. Because it's not just a question of the war in the Ukraine, Gaza, the potential conflict over Taiwan, but even if you look at almost all the stats, the Uppsala Institute monitors, for example, organized state violence around the world, the CSIS index on governments at war either with themselves or with other countries, both of them are all at record highs. 350,000 people died last year in organized state violence. And it's in wars that a lot of us aren't even paying attention to. Yemen, for example, is the bloodiest war in the world right now, 600,000 dead cumulatively. Ethiopia, 200,000 dead cumulatively, and just in 1 year. These dwarf the conflicts that get the attention, Gaza and Ukraine. But basically, war is now a relatively common phenomenon in the world. And increasingly, when I talk to diplomats, which is a big portion of my job, including Indian diplomats, they say that military conflict, or that prospect, is now actually being normalized in discussions behind closed doors by world leaders and the diplomatic community around the world. Why is this happening? So I'll give you my 2 cents, and you're free to have a completely different point of view. The core of this, I would argue, is the decision of the United States, going back roughly to the period of the first Obama administration, to accept that its primary strategic rival globally is China, and therefore it must now refocus the bulk of its resources to take on what is probably its most powerful rival in its history. And as a consequence, but this has gone at the same time with the relative decline of the United States in comparison to both China and the rest of the world, and not helped by the fact what my company now refers to as the US Second Civil War of the United States, which is that there's an enormous breakdown of domestic political consensus inside the United States, especially about foreign policy. As a result, the United States is pulling itself away from large chunks of the world. And it's actually stated in their documents. If you look at what their national, for example, the interim national security guidelines issued by the Biden administration 2 years after they came to power, they say, we will leave Afghanistan. The Middle East is reduced to the same priority as Africa. It's just the Indo-Pacific areas focusing on China, the North Atlantic, and that's it. Those are the core interests of the United States. The rest of the world, you're on your own. The vacuums that are being created by this are not being filled by anybody right now, because China definitely is not exerting itself, because it is also facing the United States. If you just look at naval, maritime dispositions across the planet of these two to the two superpowers, they're basically facing off against each other. And this is happening on a whole host of other areas. But what we are seeing is that in the vacuums being created, these regional powers or middle powers, swing states, everybody has a different name for them, are looking around and saying, how do I handle this vacuum? And I'm going to argue that there have been three broad responses. Some countries, the leaders have become delusional and said to themselves, the vacuum that has been created by the two superpowers basically leaving my area gives my country a chance to resurrect itself or become a major great power. So Russia, a country that, yes, it wasn't, Soviet Union was a superpower, but Russia's GDP is 40% of India's right now. It is no longer anything what it used to be, but it decided, under Vladimir Putin, to try to recreate the pan-Slavic empire, if you wish, of the Tsars. In Moscow, Putin is called a history man because he spends his time in the basement of the Kremlin reading ancient books and thinking to myself, this is what Russia needs to be, go back to being 400, 500 years ago. And Ukraine, the heart of Russian civilization, should be back with us. Another country, Erdogan, under Turkey, the ruler of Turkey. Turkey, 20 years ago, was a booming economy. It was the great emerging economy of the world. If you look at the figures, growing faster than anybody else. Then he decided, oh, there's a vacuum in my region. I'm going to recreate what then became known as a neo-Ottoman foreign policy. I will try to resurrect, in effect, the sphere of influence in the Eastern Mediterranean that the Ottoman Empire had, that led him into a war, into the Syrian civil war, led him into battles with Russia, with Greece, with Israel, with everybody in that region. At one point, not one country in Turkey's neighborhood had a Turkish ambassador, because they'd either been thrown out or pulled back. The relationship was so bad. Eventually, that started to ruin his economy. He responded by printing money, and their inflation rate is 80% or something now, and they've never recovered, or they're still recovering. So you have a bunch, I would even throw Israel into this delusional group, but we'll go into that if anybody wants to. A second group of countries, trying to recreate in their region effectively a small liberal international order. Can I build a regional architecture, build around trade, finance, technology, where everybody works together? Kind of what the UN was supposed to do on a global scale, but I'll do it in my region. The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, the ITU2, the IMEC, all about bringing everybody in, having them have a stake in my region, and therefore nobody disturbing the peace. Everybody has a reason to keep the Persian Gulf stable. The head of the United Arab Emirates, MBZ, met Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, in 2015 for the first time, and he said, I want India to be I want to build connectivity between our two countries, and I'll pay for it. I'll put $50 billion on the table. And Modi said, why? He said, because my region burns, and when it burns really badly. So I need everybody, including rising powers like India, to have a stake here, and I want you, as well as other countries, everybody, China, America, to have a stake. ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries, have a regional architecture. They're trying to preserve that architecture, but it's disintegrating under the impact of the US-China rivalry and is increasingly starting to break apart. But they're trying desperately to hold on to that architecture. So that's a second set of responses. A third set, I would argue, are countries, notably India, that have decided this means opportunities. We had the last panel was talking about moving supply chains, partly because of strategic technology issues, and trying to position India as a place to come to. But overall, India's response has been to be very, very cautious. The one thing I think Prime Minister Modi recognized very quickly after he came to power in 2014, that he didn't understand the global system. That when he came, he had assumed that his relationship in China with the United States would be bad, his relationship with China would be good, and he could work out a deal with Pakistan. All three of them proved to be completely wrong. And I remember I had meetings with him when I served on the National Security Advisory Board at that point, and said, I realized the world is a much more dangerous place than I'd realized. Countries are not driven, as Gujaratis seem to believe, on trade and investment. They're driven by many other deeper ghosts of the past. So what does he do? He professionalizes the entire foreign policy and national security structure of India. He brings in a career diplomat to be his foreign minister. And right now, no Indian embassy in the world has a political appointee. Everybody is a professional diplomat or military officer by the order of the prime minister. He's actually said, no amateurs in this business, it's too dangerous nowadays. So India plays its cards. I would say countries like Brazil, it's a lot less dangerous place, except if you're a football player, that you have to play your cards with caution, but you can play them in a certain way that you benefit. But India's game is very straightforward. China is very clearly India's enemy. It's our primary strategic rival. But China has the capacity to impose very high costs on India, both militarily, but really more economically. They can chop off API supplies and bring our pharmaceutical industry to its knees. So you play the China card, but you play a hard game with China, but you never cross certain red lines. And you maintain a policy of independence because China then is reassured, because China's big fear is an alliance against itself rather than individual countries trying to get at each other. But the element of what's interesting about 21st century great power rivalry is, besides the military component, all the aircraft carriers and stuff, which is obviously very important, and some of the diplomatic stuff that I've mentioned, is the importance of technology. One of the reasons the Quad exists, which is US, India, Japan, and the United States, Australia, is the press, and I'm a former journalist, so I'm not going to, but I won't excuse them, call it a NATO, Asian NATO. No, it's fundamentally about technology. And if you look at its insides, 6 major working groups, a bunch of side working groups, 26 sub-working groups, almost all of them are technology. They're about AI, quantum computing, semiconductors, green hydrogen. They just go on and on. They keep adding new ones. The Sherpas meet every month and keep adding new ones. I can't even keep track of them. I was trying to chart them once, and I met our Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, and I showed him, I said, am I getting all the working groups right? He just laughed. He said, the Quad is an iceberg. You're seeing the top 10% that's above water, and 90% is underwater, and that you'll never know about. But why was the Quad created? It's because the view is that China, which these 4 countries agree is their primary threat or primary concern, that China believes that its fundamental way to becoming the superpower is dominance of future technologies. Because that's what the United States, basically in the Chinese assessment, accomplished great power or superpower status from the 1950s onwards. And these 4 countries agree that they don't want that to happen. Not necessarily that they can stop China, but at least they don't want to be dependent on China in all of these fronts. Hence, things like China +1 and so on, because the corporate world then starts to follow a little bit later, at least the American companies are already. Now, belatedly, you see the Europeans getting in this with the trade technology commissions that they've now created with the United States, Japan, and now even India, which have the same technologies embedded in their agenda. And China itself is investing money to become less dependent on other parts of the world that it sees as dangerous. Now, this is going to be extraordinarily difficult, but it's really not so much about, there's been a lot of buzz about semiconductors, partly because of the post-COVID disruptions and how that impacted, but really, it's about the stuff that's coming up in the future. That's what governments are really focused on. If you're the king of quantum computing in the future, then virtually everybody's cybersecurity structures, the present ones, are basically obsolete. They're useless to you. You can cut through them like butter. So quantum computing, every country wants to have some capacity on that front. So this technological, strategic technology area is in many ways fundamentally makes great power rivalry today fundamentally different from almost any other previous geopolitical, should we say, fragmentation. And what we're seeing is both fragmentation and then reassembly of a lot of this as countries, in effect, first go highly national, partly because of the experience of COVID pandemic, partly because of the resurrection of so-called industrial policy and economic nationalism in a lot of these governments. And then a recognition that actually it's not going to work that way. So we go and look for other countries we can work with, minus those countries we don't trust. Which is why now, if you look in a lot of diplomacy, in a lot of the agreements and treaties being signed, the words like trusted geography, safe and secure data, for example. Data is now one of the big divisions. You can see the world starting to slowly break apart. Who do you trust with cross-border data flows? We're starting to see it spread into education. Where do you allow your PhD students to go? And if you get PhD students from another country in STEM subjects, how much access will those people get within your country? And corporations are now starting to do the same thing. They're changing as a consequence as they see these policies. Now, governments haven't worked it out. They barely understand half of this themselves. They're really crossing the river as they feel the stones, as Deng Xiaoping said, which is why companies, which is my company, lives off of the fact that other companies get like, what is the government trying to do? I don't understand. And the response is, that's because the government doesn't know itself. And they work their way through. But, you know, a lot of these technologies we're now looking at are ones that people, a lot of us, I would argue, and even in this audience, and I know you're all much masters of better and versed in technology than I am, probably don't even think. For example, I was talking to one of the deputy national security advisors of one of the Quad countries, and I said, if you were to list the three technologies the Quad you put as the top priorities, what would they be? He said AI, quantum computing. That didn't surprise me. The third, he said, is synthetic biology. And I said, synthetic biology? He said, look, that's about the weaponization of DNA. This is moving into terrain that you don't even realize. But this is like Michael Crichton stuff, you know, Andromeda Strain, if some of you may have read that, about creating weapons that are personalized to kill somebody on the basis of his genomic base. These are things now governments are looking at. So this is an area that it's actually quite fascinating, a little scary, but it's part of the new world. Now, there is about 5 minutes left. Does anybody want to have any questions that I could specifically address? Yeah, there's one person in the front. Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you very much for the talk. In your view, what is the current difference between the US and China on technology?
What is the current difference in what sense?
Who's ahead? How far ahead?
Good question. I would say that it depends on the technology. There's a lot of I think in areas like quantum computing, for example, it's hard to tell, but it's almost neck and neck from what some of the government agencies I've talked with are on. The thing about America is that in China, the assessments are partly based on what is publicly available, and a lot of what China does is government-focused. A lot of America's capacity lies in the private sector and are not very clear to the rest of the world what exactly exists. So if you look at the number of scientific journal papers and things like AI, it's actually Google and others that actually lead the way. It's no longer the national laboratories of the United States. So what happens is all the governments scare each other because they don't know what the other government, how far the other side is. But I would say that in some areas, especially where hardware is involved, the Chinese are actually very good. But it's also true that, for example, in semiconductor chips, the substances that go into semiconductor chips, Japan is well ahead of everybody else. 70% of all the materials, high-level material that goes into chips comes from Japan. Nobody else. Korea, Taiwan, nobody matches them. So it's a lot of fragmentation, but it's difficult to say. But what I would say, and I think this is something that has been clear in the Ukraine war, is basic industrial production, the West has fallen wildly behind. Critical minerals, for example, is 100% China-dominated. And it's something the Pentagon has been terrified when they've realized that their own ammunition supplies are all dependent on metals and stuff that come out of China's processing. And they are now dependent on China, in effect, to run their own war machine. So it's a mixed bag, and that's one of the things each government tries to find out. Another person there.
Thank you. Uh, of course, there are budget constraints when it comes to Indian government vis-a-vis the US government or Chinese government. Is there a framework that you've seen with the Indian government that helps the government focus on both the short term and the long term, and how they make decisions, prioritize, and define their budgets?
So, in India's case, it's actually been one of the peculiar things. I served, as I mentioned, the National Security Advisory Board for 2 prime ministers, the previous one and the present one. And both times that I served, one of the things I was asked to do as part of a panel to work on a national security doctrine for India, because India didn't have one. And it was like one of the bizarre things that even Prime Minister Manmohan Singh complained to us. He said, we have an army of 1.5 million people and we have no doctrine behind it. This makes no sense to me. But one of the curious problems India has is our capabilities keep growing very rapidly. On a scale that it's very often, by the time the document or the draft is out, we realize it's already out of date. So the government is trying one more time to do this. I know that within the board that I used to work in is going again to try this. But it has to be a living document. It has to keep changing. And that structure is something that's not easy for most governments to do. It's not easy for the Indian government to do. But there are structures that are trying to work this out. But a simple example of how fast this is growing, we have right now 42 warships that fight, not like patrol vessels or support vessels. India is building right now 68 such vessels, actually being built, which means 150% increase in capacity just because American warships are leaving the Indian Ocean, Chinese warships are entering. India wants to make sure it's involved. 10 Indian warships are now off the coast of Yemen, quietly supporting the American actions there without directly fighting the Houthis. But it's part of the fact that we have to build capacities which we never had before, and often building them faster than the doctrine can keep up. But it's a recognition that that's happening, but it's definitely there. Yeah. One last question, I think.
So, Pranit, thank you very much. Amazing, amazing session. We had, we had a talk from Micron where we spoke about the semiconductor industry, right? And being a superpower looks like that is an area which can propel India as well into, being a, $1 trillion GDP business. So, do you have any thoughts on how fast, how quick we can kind of, scale up, become a superpower in this semiconductor
specifically
space?
In just semiconductors?
Specifically in semiconductors, because I believe, we're talking about Gen A and all of that, but the underlying is actually the memory and the power, which is going to be...
So my sense is that the real game, and I know that, for example, we've had Indian government and I've been briefed on them regularly. I've had long negotiations with the Taiwanese, for example, on what we can do, what the Taiwanese can do to build up our capacity. And I think the core of it, really, the Taiwanese have argued, look, don't focus on trying to beat TSMC in India. That's just not going to happen for a long, long time. But what you should be looking at is the packaging, the design, which you already recently decently established. But look at tech manpower. There's 144 fabs by the last Taiwanese assessment being built around the world. They said 50% of them are going to be derelict in 5 years because governments are just building them without any idea what the hell there's no manpower for them. Who's going to do the technicians? Who are the technicians to run this? So they said that's where India can do this. And for the past 3 years, quietly, India has been shipping hundreds of engineers to Taiwan for that training program, right? I.e., you get the technicians. At some point, the fab guys are going to come to you because they have no way to run these machines without your capacity. So the focus really is about building niche capacities to make you essential to any semiconductor supply chain for any other government in the world. Basic supply chips for electronic appliances, cars, and so on, that's fine. Electrical vehicles will be one of the big areas. I think we'll see some movement in India. But yeah, are we going to be should we be building 2-nanometer chips? In my view, no. Too expensive, ecosystem, so many things missing in our system. 20, 30 years down, we'll see. But right now, that's where I think that's where almost willy-nilly we're going to be going. Okay. Do we have time for any other? Okay, there's one person over there.
We've been seeing a steady decline in population in major emerging
Yeah.
economies, right? So, what do you think humanoid robots and robotics will play a role in the
Oh, yeah.
days to come? And how do you think that will play out?
So, I mean, I think the country that I always go to look at robotics is Japan, because it's aging rapidly, but it also has massive robotic capacity. And already, even 20 years ago, I was struck by the fact that some of the factories I was going to in like Hamamats and other places would be giant and there'd be 2 people in them. Everything else was robotized. Now I'm told that the new generation of factories, even those 2 people have gone. And now but I can't go into those factories anymore because they said there's no visible light. There's no light. The robots don't need light. So they said as a human being, you will go into complete darkness and see nothing except hearing hissing noises and sparks. And that's where the next generation of factories in Japan is taking place, especially in high-level precision engineering. But I think what is more interesting is recently I was in Japan and I had a long discussion with the defense ministry. And I said, look, you guys have said you're going to spend $500 billion additional defense spending in the next 5 years. That's phenomenal. But you have no people. How is this going to work? And they looked at me and they said, Chaudhuri-san, this will be the new Japanese army will be robots. There will be no humans. And then they showed me a 3-hour display of a presentation. Unmanned submarines, the second prototypes are already in the water, giant fleets of drones, the works, it's all there. And Japanese style, they've worked it out, literally every quarter, every technological barrier that has to be overcome in the next 5 years. So yes, it's coming in ways that we don't even expect.
Thank you so much. That's the intersections of geopolitics, of technology, and all of those nuances that you brought to the stage. We're really grateful to have had you share your time with us.
For more content on tech and leadership, subscribe to NASSCOM YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update.